Welcome to your deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're tackling Donald Trump's 2024 campaign, but not through his speeches or, all those polished promises.
Right, right.
No, we're going deep into a raw, unfiltered source,
hmm
his recent Joe Rogan interview.
Exactly. This isn't, a carefully crafted message. This
Yeah.
is Trump unleashed.
Uh-huh.
And we get glimpses into his thinking, his frustrations, even his vulnerabilities in a way you just won't find anywhere else.
So buckle up. We'll dissect everything from his first moments in the White House to his views on tariffs, nuclear power, the 2020 election,
Yeah.
and even what he thinks the future holds.
Think of it like this. We're using this interview as a key to unlock Trump's worldview.
Right.
How he governed, how he sees America's place in the world, and what that might mean for potential second term.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Right off the bat, Trump describes walking into the White House as surreal. He even shares this anecdote about visiting the Lincoln bedroom for the first time, and you could almost hear the awe in his voice. He talks about seeing the bed Lincoln slept in the Gettysburg Address. It's not the Trump we usually see on Twitter, is it?
What's fascinating here is that you have this businessman, this showman, suddenly humbled by the weight of history.
Right.
It hints at a side of Trump that's often overshadowed. A reverence for the presidency, for American history, and how that sentiment clashes with his, brash persona, really shaped his time in office.
But that awe seems to fade pretty quickly. He goes on to compare his presidency to a constant fight for survival, saying he was under attack from the moment he won. Is this genuine, or is it the us versus them strategy we see him use so often?
It's likely both. Remember, Trump's political identity is built on being the outsider, the one battling the deep state, the media, the establishment.
Right.
He thrives on that conflict, and it clearly resonates with a segment of the population who feels similarly disillusioned with the system.
Speaking of being an outsider, he talks about the challenge of appointing 10,000 people, many of whom he didn't know personally.
Oh, wow.
He relied heavily on recommendations, which is a lot of trust when you're talking about shaping the entire government. Was this a strength or a weakness?
That's a question worth pondering. Bringing in outsiders can disrupt stagnant bureaucracy, force new perspectives.
Sure.
But relying on others' judgment, especially when you're new to the game, can backfire spectacularly. And Trump himself admits to making some hiring choices he regrets.
He specifically calls out neoconservatives, disloyal people, and those who gave bad advice.
Wow.
There's even this telling story about John Bolton. Trump admits he hired Bolton as national security advisor, despite a friend warning him against it.
That's a striking admission of poor judgment. But it also reveals something crucial about Trump's leadership style. He values loyalty above expertise or even competence, a pattern that played out throughout his presidency.
Speaking of patterns, let's talk about Trump's love affair with tariffs.
Okay.
He calls tariffs the most beautiful word in the dictionary.
Yeah.
Why is he so fixated on them?
Trump's obsession with tariffs stems from his core belief in their simplicity and directness. He sees them as a weapon to protect American jobs and punish countries he believes are engaging in unfair trade practices.
Yeah.
It's a protectionist viewpoint that ties directly into his America First philosophy.
He even suggests replacing income tax with tariffs, which sounds pretty radical. Is that even remotely feasible or just campaign bluster?
Replacing income tax with tariffs is a highly controversial idea. Economists have warned it could lead to price hikes, trade wars, and ultimately harm the very people Trump claims to protect, American workers. But the fact that he floats such an idea shows his willingness to upend conventional thinking, even if it means shaking up the entire economic system.
Okay, so maybe not the best economic plan. Let's move on to the environment.
Okay.
Trump boasts about having the cleanest air and water during his presidency, but then blames China for pollution and criticizes expensive environmental regulations. How does that add up?
This reflects a key tension in Trump's environmental stance. He wants to claim credit for positive outcomes, but simultaneously rejects the very policies and scientific consensus that contribute to environmental protection. It's a contradiction that highlights his focus on economic growth over environmental concerns, a theme you'll notice throughout his policies.
He even tells this story about California's water shortage. He blames Governor Newsom for rejecting his plan to solve it, painting himself as always as the capable leader thwarted by political opponents.
That anecdote, like many others in this interview, illustrates Trump's tendency to personalize complex issues. He simplifies them into battles between heroes and villains, which plays well with his base but often obscures the real challenges and potential solutions.
From economic policies to the environment, it seems like there's a pattern here. Now let's shift to something a bit more explosive. Nuclear power. Trump expresses both admiration and fear, calling it clean energy, but acknowledging its dangers. What do you make of this?
Trump's stance on nuclear power mirrors the complexity of the issue itself. Nuclear energy offers a potentially clean source of power, but the risks associated with accidents and waste disposal are immense.
Right?
His conflicted view reflects that ongoing debate between potential benefits and very real dangers.
Interestingly, he then pivots to talking about creating Space Force and praising Elon Musk for SpaceX and Starlink. What's the connection there?
This is where Trump's vision for American power comes into play. He sees space as a new frontier for dominance and innovation. By highlighting Musk's achievements, he's showcasing American entrepreneurial spirit and technological prowess, tying it back to his Make America Great Again narrative.
Okay, so we've covered his first days in office, his views on trade and the environment, and even his take on nuclear power and space. But now we're getting into some really contentious territory. The 2020 election,
Okay.
Trump, as you might expect, repeatedly claims he won, citing irregularities and alleging that Wisconsin virtually admitted the election was rigged.
This is where we need to be incredibly careful to distinguish between Trump's claims and verifiable facts. Multiple investigations and court rulings have debunked his claims of a stolen election. There is no credible evidence of widespread fraud that would have changed the outcome.
He also attacks mail-in ballots and electronic voting machines, pushing for a return to paper ballots. While election security is important, is he using these concerns to sow distrust in the system, or are his fears legitimate?
While ensuring election integrity is crucial, Trump's persistent focus on these issues, despite the lack of evidence, has significantly eroded public trust in the democratic process. His rhetoric, whether intentional or not, fuels doubt and undermines faith in the very foundation of American democracy.
This is already a lot to digest, and we're not even done.
Yeah.
But before we dive into the final part of this deep dive, which covers Trump's predictions for the future and his plans if elected again, let's pause here for a moment.
Yeah, let's take a breath. Let's take a breath and consider what we've uncovered so far. This interview isn't just about specific policies. It's a window into how Trump thinks, how he leads, and how he views the world.
It's definitely given me a lot to think about. I'm starting to see some clear patterns in his approach, his rhetoric, even his vulnerabilities.
Exactly. And those patterns are crucial for understanding his potential second term. He's not a traditional politician. He plays by his own rules, and that can be both captivating and concerning.
Okay, so let's dig into those patterns. What's the biggest takeaway you've gotten from this interview about Trump's worldview?
It reinforces his unwavering confidence in his own abilities.
Okay.
He sees himself as the ultimate dealmaker, the one who can fix what others can't, whether it's the economy, foreign policy, or even something like California's water shortage.
And that self-assuredness that I alone can fix it attitude really resonates with a segment of voters who are looking for a strong leader. Someone who isn't afraid to shake things up.
Precisely. He taps into a feeling of disillusionment with the system, with politics as usual. He offers simple, bold solutions, even if they're not entirely realistic, and that appeals to people who are frustrated with the complexities of government.
But there's also a strong sense of paranoia that runs through this interview. He talks about being constantly under attack, surrounded by enemies both foreign and domestic.
That siege mentality is a key part of his narrative.
Yeah.
It fuels his impulsiveness, his reliance on loyalty over expertise, and his tendency to lash out at perceived threats.
Yeah.
It's like he's perpetually on the defensive, even when he's in a position of power.
And that defensiveness shapes how he communicates. He often simplifies complex issues into battles between good and evil, portraying himself as the hero fighting against corrupt forces.
It's a powerful tactic that allows him to bypass nuanced debate and connect directly with voters' emotions. He's not just presenting policy positions, he's telling a story, and in that story, he's always the protagonist.
So as we move into the final part of our deep dive, where we'll hear Trump's predictions for the future and what he plans to do if elected again, it's important to keep these patterns in mind.
Absolutely. Pay attention to how he frames the challenges facing America, the solutions he proposes, and the role he casts for himself in this unfolding narrative.
Okay, so picking up where we left off, Trump ends the interview talking about the future, both with and without him at the helm. He seems confident he can solve global issues like the war in Ukraine, but warns of dire consequences if he's not the one in charge.
That mix of optimism and doom is a hallmark of his rhetoric. He paints himself as the savior, the only one who can avert disaster, while simultaneously stoking fears about the alternatives.
It's a high-stakes gamble, essentially saying, choose me or else.
Exactly. And it's a gamble that has proven effective in the past. By raising the stakes so high, he creates a sense of urgency that can overshadow more reasoned considerations. It taps into a deep-seated desire for security and stability, especially in times of uncertainty.
This interview really drives home the point that understanding Trump's words requires understanding the story he's telling, the role he's playing, and the emotions he's trying to evoke.
Precisely. It's not just about dissecting specific policies, it's about deciphering a worldview, a leadership style, and a way of connecting with a particular segment of the American public.
Speaking of connecting with the public, remember those charts Trump showed Rogan,
Oh, yeah.
comparing the U.S. to other developed countries in terms of healthcare costs and life expectancy?
Yeah.
The ones that painted a pretty grim picture for America.
Those charts are a prime example of how Trump uses data, even if selectively, to reinforce his narrative. They tap into a very real anxiety among Americans about the state of healthcare. The rising costs, the seemingly inadequate outcomes.
He's essentially saying, look, the system is broken and only I can fix it. And he proposes these radical solutions like replacing income tax with tariffs, which we've already discussed is probably not feasible.
Right. But the point is, he's offering bold, simple solutions to complex problems. And that resonates with people who are tired of bureaucratic gridlock and feel like the government isn't working for them.
So it's about more than just the policies themselves. It's about tapping into a feeling of frustration, a desire for change.
Exactly. And that's something to keep in mind as we continue to analyze his pronouncements. Look beyond the surface, consider the emotional appeal, and ask yourself, what need is he trying to fulfill with this message?
Okay, that's a really helpful framework.
Yeah.
Now, Trump also made some alarming claims about immigration, saying other countries are emptying their prisons into the United States, sending us their worst criminals. He even suggests this is a deliberate strategy to harm America.
This is a classic example of fear-mongering.
Yeah.
While there have been instances of criminals being deported, there's no evidence to support his claim that it's a widespread intentional policy aimed at destabilizing America.
But by painting immigrants as dangerous criminals, he taps into existing anxieties about border security, cultural change, and economic competition.
Exactly. He's playing on those fears to create a sense of urgency to justify his calls for stricter immigration controls and to reinforce the us versus them narrative that's so central to his appeal.
And he proposes solutions that have been widely criticized, like building a wall along the entire U.S.-Mexico border and banning Muslims from entering the country. These are policies that many experts argue are impractical, discriminatory, and even unconstitutional.
You're right, those policies have sparked intense debate and legal challenges, but their appeal lies in their simplicity and perceived strength. They offer a seemingly clear-cut solution to a complex problem, even if that solution is ultimately flawed or harmful.
So again, it's not just about the policy itself. It's about the message it sends, the emotions it evokes, and the narrative it reinforces.
Precisely. And that's why it's so crucial to engage in critical thinking. Don't just accept these pronouncements at face value. Question the evidence, consider alternative perspectives, and form your own conclusions based on a balanced assessment of the facts.
Excellent advice. Now, another recurring theme in this interview is Trump's attacks on the media. He calls them fake news, biased against him, even the enemy of the people. Is there any truth to these accusations?
While all media outlets have their own perspectives and potential biases, to claim the entire media is fake news is a dangerous oversimplification. A free and independent press is essential for holding power accountable and informing the public.
But his attacks resonate with those who feel distrustful of traditional news sources, who are more likely to believe conspiracy theories or alternative narratives.
Absolutely. By constantly attacking the media, he discredits any information that challenges his version of events, creating an us versus them dynamic where his supporters are encouraged to only trust his word.
It's a way of controlling the narrative and making it very difficult to have open, honest conversations about the issues facing our country.
Exactly. And that's why media literacy is so important. We need to be discerning consumers of information, able to recognize bias, evaluate sources, and think critically about the messages we're being bombarded with.
Great point. Okay, let's shift gears to another area where Trump has consistently challenged conventional wisdom: foreign policy. He boasts about his deal-making skills, his ability to get better deals for America than anyone else. He's also been criticized for his unconventional approach, alienating allies, and his admiration for authoritarian leaders. What does this interview tell us about his foreign policy outlook?
It confirms his view of foreign policy as a zero-sum game where strength and dominance are key. He sees himself as a master negotiator who can outsmart other world leaders and get what he wants for America regardless of traditional diplomatic norms.
He often describes his interactions with foreign leaders in very personal terms, emphasizing his ability to charm or bully them into submission.
It's a highly transactional approach to diplomacy, one that often prioritizes immediate gains over long-term strategic alliances or multilateral cooperation. And it can be quite unpredictable, as we've seen in his dealings with both allies and adversaries.
His foreign policy has definitely produced a mixed bag of results, some surprising successes alongside some significant setbacks. It's hard to predict what a second term would look like on the world stage.
That's a wild card, to be sure. His willingness to upend the status quo and operate outside established norms creates both opportunities and risks. And his personal relationships with other leaders, rather than consistent diplomatic strategies, seem to drive a lot of his decision-making.
So when it comes to foreign policy, it seems like we're in for another roller coaster ride if he's elected again.
That's a safe bet. Buckle up.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about Trump's worldview, his leadership style, his approach to domestic and foreign policy, and his strategies for connecting with voters. But there's still more to unpack. Let's take a quick pause and Atcha.
Okay, we're back, and I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into Trump's interview with Joe Rogan. We talked about his first term, his campaign promises for 2024, and even his thoughts on the future of America.
And I think we can all agree it's been quite a ride.
It has. You know, whether you love him or hate him, Trump is never boring. No, he's not. He's a master of grabbing attention and keeping people talking.
He really is. And this interview gave us a glimpse behind the curtain.
Exactly. It's raw, unfiltered Trump. And that's valuable, whether you agree with him or not.
Absolutely, because it helps us understand how he thinks, how he sees the world, and ultimately what that might mean for his potential second term.
Exactly. We've seen his leadership style, his approach to policy, his way of connecting with voters. It's all there in this interview.
So what's the big takeaway for our listeners? What do you think they should keep in mind as they navigate this election season?
Well, I think the most important thing is to be informed and engaged. Don't just accept sound bites and headlines at face value.
Right. Do your own research.
Exactly. Dig deeper, consider multiple perspectives, and most importantly, think critically about the information you're consuming.
Because there's a lot of noise out there.
There is. And it's easy to get swept up in the rhetoric, the emotions, the fear-mongering.
That's true. So take a step back. Be discerning, be skeptical, and most importantly, form your own conclusions.
Exactly. Don't let anyone tell you what to think. Figure it out for yourself.
That's great advice. I think we'll leave it there for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the mind of Donald Trump.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, happy learning.